Deep within the human mind lie realms uncharted on any map, woven from the threads of thought, emotion, and memory. These inner worlds, as the insightful Carl Jung warned, can pose a far greater threat than any external danger, gradually eroding the very essence of our being. We are not merely speaking of harmful habits or minor flaws, but of entire psychic landscapes where the individual loses bearings, clarity, and self-esteem. Jung, with his profound understanding of human suffering, saw in it the potential for personal growth and transformation. However, he also pointed to the existence of certain states where suffering becomes destructive and fruitless, bringing no positive change. What follows is an exploration of 7 such places that the soul should avoid, drawing upon the psychological and philosophical insights of Carl Jung. First on this list is the house of denial, where one stubbornly refuses to acknowledge their shadow. Jung once remarked, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate." In Jungian psychology, the shadow represents all those aspects of our personality that we prefer to ignore or suppress. This includes feelings such as anger, envy, selfishness, as well as our sexual desires, fears, traumas, and even hidden talents and unrealized potential. It is important to understand that the shadow itself is not evil. It is simply an unexplored part of ourselves. Denial presents itself not merely as an evasion of external reality, but as a rejection of those aspects of one's own personality that are perceived as undesirable, shameful, or threatening. By ignoring their shadow side, a person unwittingly becomes its puppet, displaying passive aggression, undermining their own relationships, projecting their shortcomings onto others, or giving vent to uncontrolled emotional outbursts. This is precisely what Jung meant when he asserted that the unconscious governs a person's life. The individual will repeatedly encounter recurring scenarios, emotional distress and failures, not because of a hostile world, but because their shadow is leading them blindly. Dwelling in denial is akin to building a house of distorted mirrors, reflecting warped images of everyone but oneself. One tends to see the world as full of negative people, failing to realize that they themselves are replaying their unhealed wounds. They blame others for their failures, not understanding that they have surrendered their power to that part of themselves they refuse to confront. The danger of denial lies in its deceptive safety. One tends to believe that self-analysis entails a loss of control, emotional breakdown, and disintegration of personality. However, Carl Jung held the opposite view, considering the encounter with one's own shadow as the starting point for genuine control, strength, and healing. Integration of the shadow frees one from the manipulations of the unconscious, delivers one from uncontrolled outbursts of anger over trivial matters, and from the obsessive pursuit of those who do not reciprocate. The need to please everyone and hide behind masks disappears. Instead, the individual attains wholeness, albeit not perfect, but authentic, human, grounded, and aware. Jung called this process individuation, the unification of conscious and unconscious aspects of the psyche into a single self. This process begins with courage, the courage to admit that one is not as flawless, peace-loving, and collected as one wants to appear. Therefore, when experiencing envy, one should not deny it, but rather question its causes. When feeling hatred, one should not mask it with false kindness, but trace its roots. When feeling rage, one should not suppress it until it explodes, but listen to what it is trying to communicate. After all, the shadow, brought into the light, loses its power, while the shadow that is ignored merely waits for its moment to act surreptitiously against the individual. One should not build their life on the foundation of denial, trying to hide the truth from themselves. One must delve into the depths of their inner world, into the hidden corners of the soul. One should release from oblivion those parts of themselves that have been buried under the weight of the past and enter into dialogue with them. The purpose of this conversation is not to condemn them, but to achieve a deep understanding of their nature. Only then can one break free from the grip of predetermined fate and begin to live in accordance with their true essence. Another danger lurks in the swamp of resentment, where pain finds no transformation. The renowned psychologist Carl Jung asserted that the conscious exploration of suffering can lead to a profound transformation of personality. However, when pain is silenced, denied, or relived again and again without proper reflection, it transforms into something more sinister, into resentment. Resentment is pain poisoned by venom. It's a never-ending story about how a person has been treated unfairly, betrayed, forgotten, or deprived of love. It thrives on constant repetition. And, like a swamp, the longer a person stays in it, the harder it is to get out. Everything becomes heavier, slows down, gets stuck. To live in resentment is to carry old wounds as an integral part of one's personality. A person mired in resentment may notice themselves saying phrases like, "This always happens to me," "People never change," or "They'll regret how they treated me." At that moment, healing is impossible. The person only hopes that their pain will serve as justification. But resentment never punishes the one who caused the pain. It punishes the resentful person. They begin to withdraw, lose trust in others, and love with suspicion. Ultimately, they may turn into the very thing they resented, a bitter, cold, and cruel person. The victim becomes a mirror image of the abuser. Carl Jung warned that the shadow creeps in unnoticed, instilling a false sense of righteousness based on pain and consequently the sanctity of anger. However, as the insightful psychologist asserted, unexplored anger turns into shackles that bind the spirit. In Jungian psychology, forgiveness is seen not as absolving the offender of responsibility, but as breaking these chains, as a bold step towards reclaiming one's own energy held captive by the past. This means acknowledging what happened, recognizing the pain, but also having a firm intention not to let that event define one's future life. Transforming pain does not imply forgetting, but rather giving it meaning, learning a lesson, gaining strength, and establishing the boundaries it taught. Jung called this the alchemy of the psyche, transforming emotional lead into the gold of wisdom and experience. Therefore, if a person finds themselves trapped in resentment, it is worth stopping and asking, am I fueling this feeling or freeing myself from it? After all, the swamp of resentment is always ready to offer a place to rest, but one should not mistake this immobility for true peace. There is also a prison of guilt and shame, where the self is condemned. It is important to distinguish between guilt and shame. Guilt says, "I made a mistake," while shame whispers, "I am a mistake." Jung considered shame to be one of the most dangerous emotional states, not because of its dramatic nature, but because of its quiet, secretive nature. It hides in the nooks and crannies of the psyche, whispering that a person is unworthy, unloved, and irreparable, poisoning self-perception and hindering personal growth. Many people languishing in this invisible inner prison appear outwardly quite prosperous. They enthusiastically dedicate themselves to work, shower others with smiles, achieve certain heights, but deep down they are tormented by an unwavering belief in their own inadequacy. No achievement brings them satisfaction, no love seems deserved, and even sincere forgiveness from others cannot break through the wall they have built. This is a truly tragic manifestation of shame, which does not simply cause unpleasant sensations, but alienates a person from themselves, suggesting that in order to gain recognition, even in one's own eyes, it is necessary to become completely different. Carl Jung argued that true healing begins not with striving for perfection, but with accepting oneself as one is. He did not advocate for indulgence and justification of bad deeds, but warned against endless self-flagellation, emphasizing that the psyche needs space for development, which is impossible in conditions of constant self-condemnation. Endlessly dwelling in guilt when the lesson has already been learned is not a sign of nobility, but rather an act of self-destruction. True repentance should push towards growth, towards correcting mistakes and taking responsibility, while prolonged and relentless shame leads to complete paralysis. Carl Jung urges us to confront the inner critic, asking about the source of its voice. Where exactly did the idea of needing to deserve love, of feeling one's own inadequacy originate. Often, the roots of this shame lie in childhood, religious beliefs, past traumas, or constant comparisons with others. However, despite this, we continue to carry this burden as an immutable law. But everyone is free to start opening the door to this prison today. It's not about destroying the past, but about refusing to let it define one's own worth. Mistakes made are not a defining trait of personality, and the past does not predetermine fate. The soul is not intended to live in constant condemnation. Its natural environment is growth and development, not guilt, freedom, not fear, self-respect, not self-denial. And if a person strives for healing, they must be ready to look at themselves in the mirror, not to look for flaws, but to offer themselves compassion and understanding. As Jung asserted, only by accepting oneself in full, with all the light and dark aspects, can one achieve true wholeness. Jung introduced the concept of the persona, the social mask we wear to adapt to the world around us. It is the image of ourselves that we display to earn recognition, admiration, or protection. However, despite the necessity of the persona for functioning in society, complete immersion in it means losing oneself. The theatre of the persona is a place where the play becomes identity. A person starts with a mask and then forgets its existence. They smile when they really want to cry, agree when their soul protests, dress, speak, and behave not to express themselves, but to maintain the approval of others. And gradually, imperceptibly, they disappear. Their true self, their desires, pain, creative impulses, and inner chaos are displaced into the unconscious. They become a character in someone else's story, playing a role in a script not written by them. Carl Jung persistently warned against the danger of hypocrisy, asserting that the human soul cannot flourish in an atmosphere of pretense. The longer an individual plays a role concealing their true face, the further they drift from their inner life. Ultimately, this leads to a sense of exhaustion, emotional numbness, and even deep depression. The problem is not the absence of meaning in life, but that such a life ceases to be one's own. In such a situation, authenticity is not merely absent, it represents a real threat. Revealing one's true self carries the risk of being rejected by society, but Jung was convinced that achieving wholeness is impossible without accepting this risk. The process of individuation, that is, the path to psychological maturity, requires a person to gradually shed the mask they wear and honestly answer the question, who am I really? Rejecting the theatre of the persona is not a rebellion against social norms, but rather a return to one's true essence, one's soul. It is a process of reclaiming the silenced voice, the deferred dream, and the buried values. No matter how attractive the mask may seem, if it does not reflect a person's inner truth, it will never bring a sense of satisfaction and self-love. Instead, it will only amplify the feeling of loneliness and alienation. The fifth scourge of modern man is the enchanted labyrinth of excessive rumination, where the mind, meant to be a faithful assistant, turns into a sophisticated trap. Carl Jung, a perceptive explorer of the human psyche, warned of the danger that awaits the individual whose mind is detached from the deep roots of the authentic self. In such a state, the mind becomes like a labyrinth, an endless series of loops and dead ends, a prison woven from analysis and logical constructs, where thought never finds its completion and truth remains unattainable. Dwelling in this labyrinth means substituting true wisdom with fruitless reflections. One plunges into an endless thought process, trying to resolve their inner torments through logic, striving to subdue the relentless march of the future with predictions, and vainly attempting to alter the past through the power of imagination. However, the deeper one delves into these reflections, the further one strays from the cherished clarity. Jung tirelessly emphasized the importance of intuition, symbols, and the mysterious depths of the unconscious, those aspects of the psyche that defy rational comprehension. He was convinced that healing and the attainment of meaning in life often stem from irrational depths, not from logical constructs. But in the labyrinth of excessive rumination, the voice of the heart is muffled, the signals of the body are ignored, and the voice of the soul, quiet, intuitive, and symbolic, is drowned out in the cacophony of intrusive thoughts. Excessive rumination creates an illusion of safety and control, but, in essence, is fear skillfully disguised as intellect. It keeps a person in a state of paralysis before making decisions, emotional numbness, and spiritual disconnection. Jung urged, "Do not try to resolve life, but feel it, dream about it, live it." For the soul speaks not in the language of formulas, but in the language of metaphors, images, feelings, and silence. To break free from this labyrinth, one must learn to trust again, not only one's logic, but also one's instincts, one's inner knowing. One must be willing to act even without having all the answers, to stop endlessly replaying the past and start living in the present. True wisdom lies not in possessing comprehensive knowledge, but in knowing when to stop one's reflections and begin to live life to the fullest. The sixth danger on the path to self-discovery is the lifeless desert of isolation, where the fear of genuine connection becomes all-consuming. Carl Jung, the insightful explorer of the human soul, recognized long before modern psychologists an undeniable truth: the healing of emotional wounds is impossible in isolation. The soul finds solace and growth in relationships, in the complex interplay of human destinies. However, when pain becomes unbearable, many seek refuge in a psychological desert, a vast, desolate, and arid space that seems safe but is devoid of life force. In this secluded place, a person convinces themselves that others are unnecessary, seeing in people only a potential threat. Love appears to be an unaffordable luxury, a risk to be avoided at all costs. At first, such detachment may be perceived as gaining freedom and independence. The absence of expectations, disappointments, and betrayals creates an illusion of control over one's own life. However, gradually the silence becomes unbearable, and loneliness, once desired, turns into a painful exile. In this scorched desert, vulnerability is the main enemy. A person becomes excessively self-reliant, erecting impenetrable walls around their emotions and developing a deep skepticism towards any intimacy. But in reality, by avoiding others, they are running away from those parts of themselves that seem unworthy of love and acceptance. Jung reminds us that wounds are inflicted in relationships, but healing also comes through them, working with shadow aspects of personality, overcoming the consequences of trauma, deep self-knowledge. All this is certainly necessary, but only when a person finds the courage to appear before another soul, openly declaring, "Here I am, imperfect, real, but still worthy of love," do they find their true humanity. Self-isolation is tantamount to existing in a world without reflections, devoid of the life-giving interaction with others, without the stimulus for development and the happiness of being understood. Of course, closeness with others can bring suffering, but it also opens the way to joy, because the human soul is not intended for solitude. Its natural state is belonging to society. There is another danger, the graveyard of the past, which Jung warned about, where people reject the present. This is a deceptive place where a person escapes, unable to free themselves from guilt, regret, nostalgia, or sorrow. It seems that grieving is sacred, and remembering is noble. However, living in the past is tantamount to rejecting the present. A person turns into a shadow, wandering through memories, reliving old wounds again and again, vainly trying to resurrect what is gone forever. The mind paints pictures of what could have been, the heart clings to what is lost, and the present becomes blurred, ignored, unlived, and unloved. Jung argued that the human psyche constantly strives for wholeness, which is achievable only in the present moment. By immersing themselves in the past, a person misses the opportunities that are opening up before them now. Letting go of the past does not mean forgetting it. It means honoring it without allowing it to define the present. It means learning to say goodbye, not only to people but also to those versions of oneself that no longer correspond to the path of life. In the past, one can find lessons, but not life, not new breath, not forward movement. So if fate suddenly takes you to this mournful graveyard of memories, where you relive past emotional torments and betrayals again and again, stop for a moment and consider, what exactly are you trying to preserve in memory? What has long lost connection with your real life? Accept what happened with sadness, forgive the offenders, wish them well, and leave it all in the past. For, as Jung wisely noted, true life lies not in desperately holding on to the fleeting past, but in striving to become who you are meant to be here and now, in a state of full awareness. Leave those places that diminish your essence, and boldly step into the space where your soul can breathe freely. Do not postpone it until tomorrow, and do not wait until you feel ready. Do it right